Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talking Leadership. This is Eric Perez welcoming you back once again to our ongoing leadership podcast series. And today I've got the pleasure of catching up with a good friend to me in this industry over the last 10 years and is a well-known figure in the commercial seafood industry in Australia. So I'm just going to do, as I have in all of my podcasts, go through a background of our guest today before introducing him more formally to everybody. So today, the guest that we have on our podcast wears multiple hats, and how our guest does the amount of work that he does is well beyond me, but it just demonstrates the kind of person he is. And so he is the owner and proprietor of CA Consultants. He has also been a facilitator for the National Seafood Industry Leadership Program, a fantastic program run by Affectus through Jill Briggs and her team. He is also currently the EO for many small inshore fishery groups in the country, and he also works as an executive officer for the FRDC Indigenous Reference Group. Can I welcome to the podcast Mr. Chris Calogeras? How are you, Chris?
Good, thanks, Eric. Sounded pretty impressive, didn't it?
Mate, it's a brilliant CV, and just demonstrates the depth and breadth of your leadership experience. So this conversation we're going to have will be hopefully for the listeners quite an eye-opening one, because you bring a lot of different experiences to the roles that you've had. And for me, someone who's known you for quite some time, when I actually went through the types of roles that you have and looking at your LinkedIn profile, which doesn't do them justice, I really do think, do you ever sleep?
Well, I do now, and I'm finding that I need to sleep more and more and more. So when we're having a little brief chat before, Eric, I have decided that it's sort of time to start pulling back from some of these roles and give myself a chance to sleep and smell the roses, so to speak.
Yep, and that's fair enough. And again, that'll bring a slightly different perspective to this podcast when we've got an established leadership person like yourself, or being able to look back on a career and provide some context to some of these questions from this very interesting background that you're living at the moment. So can I start where I've started with all my podcast questions? In which industry was your first leadership role, and why did you take it on, Chris?
So I had a very varied background. I didn't come into the fishing industry with the intention of being in the fishing industry. I got a traineeship with the Department of Primary Industries and Fisheries in the NT, and I was looking to work in the plant section, but I got dragged into the fisheries portfolio, and so I came in without the aim of being in the fisheries sector. And that traineeship that I did there actually gave me a lot of understanding of a lot of the things that I probably shouldn't be doing. So my first real leadership roles happened when I was working in the NT government, and by natural attrition, I sort of kept working my way up the leadership pool until I started leading the fisheries management group in the NT in the sort of 90s. And that was a very different role to where I sit now, because it was about working with public servants and generating the outcomes that you need to through the public service through a very structured approach. And while I was doing this, I found that I was actually investing a lot of energy working with the industry to get the outcomes that I needed, but also that would benefit them. So the real leadership started happening around that time, about understanding the tensions between government drivers and industry needs, and the need to have good, strong management so that we can both function well.
Yeah, okay, and that was your lead into to industry. So what, just out of curiosity and as a follow-up to this question, what made you make the jump to the other side of the table, so to speak?
So by the late 2000s, I sort of acted in a bunch of roles in the department and had quite a senior role. but I'd always invested heavily with industry people. So I could go and talk to people, give them the bad news about the things that were happening in fisheries management in those days, which was about reducing license numbers from basically open access days. And I developed a really strong relationship with the people in the mud crab industry in the NT. And they were mainly Vietnamese and Cambodian people who had come to Australia and developed a lifestyle around that industry. And one of the people that were involved there, Mr. Long, had set up a really strong business around buying and selling the crabs interstate, but they were about to embark on an expansion that it looked at export, needing to deal with government agencies, international and national, and local. And so they said to me, "Oh, Chris, could you just come and give us a hand for 12 months while we set all this stuff up?" And it was quite an interesting conversation because I said, "Look, I've got a good job in the government. Life is okay there. It's consistent." And as I kept saying all the things that were good about it, I realised there was a whole bunch of stuff I missed doing, which is about something ever finishing, because if you've ever worked in the government, as soon as you've finished one piece of work, it's actually being reviewed again. And also the structure of advice that we used to provide, ministerial advice, went from being using our expertise and providing options or sound advice to the ministers, to change that to be actually developing the policy documents that met the political need versus the best fisheries management need.
Ah, wow. So that, and I'll just for the sake of our listeners, this is the perennial issue in at least our industry, is that tension between trying to do what is best for industry that may or may not be politically palatable versus straddling that political pathway as a public servant. So did that hit you pretty hard, that tension, Chris?
Yeah, it did actually. And it wasn't just, I always try to play straight down the line, and that's one of the reasons I can still work so well with industry groups, is because I was down the line. If it needed happening, I would make sure it happened. If it didn't need happening, I would push back from both sides. And there was some of the push we were getting wasn't just about industry. It was about ministerial and policy, not even the ministers. Sometimes it's their advisors who were suggesting that we should take particular pathways, but the end result was it would minimise political grief. And, it made me think, from being somebody who could provide high-level, strong direction for industry, to becoming an administrative clerk, which there's nothing wrong with being an administrative clerk, but I didn't think that's where I could be best used. So I went off and worked and part of the reason I went and worked for a company that was called Seeking Seafoods was that they wanted to improve the way the industry ran as well, and part of my role working for them was to be an advocate for industry. And some of the funniest things was that within the first few months I was going back to the department and saying, "Look, this is a really bad piece of policy or legislation." And the feedback I was getting was, "But that was yours. You did it."
Yeah.
And I said, "Exactly." So I've come in from developing policy, which I thought was fit for purpose, to actually realising it wasn't, and it was adding no value, and it was just a burden. And I still see that regulatory burden and policy burden that plays on industry, but it also plays on the government's ability to move forward on a whole bunch of issues as well. So so I did 12 months. I took 12 months leave without pay, and then I went to go back to government, and they rejigged the job for me, and I did the interview. I was the only person that got interviewed. I did the interview, and I went home to my wife and told her, I said, "Oh, Gail, look, I've just done the interview. I reckon I've smashed it. But as I was answering all the questions, I realised it was the last thing in the world I wanted to do at the time. So I went back and told the department that I was withdrawing from the interview, wasn't interested in the job, and that did cause me a little bit of grief for a while, Eric, I can tell you. So
okay, wow.
Yeah.
I'll move then, Chris, if it's okay,
Yep.
to asking you a question around specific leadership areas in a second. But it's interesting that you say that you suffered some repercussions from moving on, and I guess that's in your experience as a leader and those that you've seen elsewhere, that sometimes you've got to make some critical decisions, and sometimes you foresee the consequences, and sometimes you don't, but you end up invariably being better off by having made a tough choice. Does that ring true for you?
Yeah, I think that, I could have sat in that job and I'd probably be, just by natural attrition, I'd be in a very strong position in the NT government. But for me, it just didn't feel like I needed a change. As all through my career, and this is really a bad thing if you're a consultant, is that I really like to learn and to change. And so, like, a good consultant finds a formula and sticks to it and keeps making money from it. But I find I get quite bored from that. So I'm always looking for a new challenge. And I think that if your circumstances allow it, it's a great thing to do. So we all don't have the opportunity to make those choices, Eric. Sometimes our lives get in the road and we've got families and responsibilities and economic and personal issues that don't let us fulfill our dreams. And so we end up having to stay there, and then it becomes harder and harder and harder to make the move. So I think change is good for people in leadership roles for a couple of reasons. One is it gives you a chance to refresh, and secondly, if you've done your job well, you've got a cohort of people that are ready to fill the space behind you and do it differently. So
there's a lot of truth in that.
Yeah.
So, mate, in your travels, have you seen much of a difference between what you call the leadership function and management?
Yeah, I think that's a critical issue, Eric. That's a really good question. Is that people often equate the two, but I think they're actually two very, very different things. So for me, management is about the functionality of running something, getting the logistics, the operations right, having your good policies in position, the structures are in place, and that's a very functional approach. Whereas I think leadership is that ability to be a bit more nimble on your feet, and management is often like leader-servant approach, whereas good leadership, I think, has to have a more collegiate approach so that you can actually help guide people down a particular path. So I see a massive difference. And when we run the National Seafood Industry Leadership Program, people have often come in who have done management training, and their focus is on the functionality of things, whereas leadership is those things about getting the best out of people, understanding the opportunities, treating people not as functional components of an organised structure. Once we shifted to that term human resources, we stopped talking about people. We just thought of people as resources rather than people who bring their own understanding and learnings to everything we do.
Yeah, I haven't, and thank you for sharing that. I haven't had it broached in that way, but it lends itself to a interesting conversation around why some forms of management functions have dehumanized the roles that they're operating under, and human resource management is quite a classic one that, it's a lot easier to deal with human beings when you can reduce those in, let's say, a large company, even a small company, into numbers rather than people.
Yep, exactly.
There's less stress involved if you're dealing with culling a number than you are looking someone in the face and telling them they don't have a job, or they've been made redundant, and et cetera, and all of us can relate in different ways.
See that in the fishing industry now. The leadership. Look, it's a difficult job doing what people in the agencies have to do. I'm not poo-pooing that. It's a really difficult thing to take people's livelihoods away from them and destroy communities. But I think that the part of the problem has been, as we've shifted to a more economic, rational approach to everything, fishing is about numbers now. And so people look at it as, oh, well, the economic drivers indicate that we should have X amount of commercial fishing, X amount of recreation, X amount of indigenous. And every time we make one of those decisions, people's lives are impacted. As you would know in Queensland here, Eric, the grief and stress the recent restructures have caused. Now, that to me that has been undertaken through a management approach. So the data tells us this is how we're going to approach it. Here's a functional way of dealing with that problem. A real leadership approach would be to work together to find those common areas, common vision, common areas, and then get the common approach about how we could have restructured these fisheries to give us the best economic and social outcomes that we need.
Yeah, I agree, Chris, and it would have been nice to have you helping lead the reform up here, but that's a totally different podcast. We could talk for hours on that. And
yeah, I wasn't particularly picking on Queensland approach. It's just that approach is happening everywhere in Australia, in the fishing world.
Yeah, sure.
Every state, every jurisdiction has gone through this, and some have done it better than others. And it's often the management versus leadership that has been the driver in that.
And again, that's an interesting way to look at that. And for those that are listening that may not have a as in-depth an understanding of the industry as Chris has, or if I've been able to develop over a 10-year period. Some people would still say I'm a young pup in the industry, but what I see cast in that leadership management dichotomy is also the layering of the political agenda. And that one is one that you can't walk away from, and it does impact how those two functions occur, at least in this industry. I can't speak for others. So look, no, Chris, I appreciate your thoughts on that. Now, I'd like to move, if I could, to the human side of leaders. So, people make mistakes. How do you engage with an error or mistake that's attributed to your leadership, mate?
Well, I think the first thing is you've got to own up to it. So real leadership is about accepting the fact that we're not all perfect and we do make mistakes. And to actually grow in the leadership role, Eric, sometimes you got to take risks, and those risks don't always come out the way you'd hope they would. I think thinking about when we've done our leadership program in the past, we put our de bono hats on and we think about things in different ways. And I think by as you're about to make decisions, you need to think about the consequences that could happen, and then start developing some strategies and plans around that. But I think the main thing is you've got to fess up to it. Good leadership isn't about deflecting blame onto other people or highlighting other people's shortcomings. It's stepping up and taking responsibility yourself.
Yeah, I believe that 100%, mate. So look,
probably just one other thing around that too is that sometimes you may have the part of the reason that whatever you'd hoped for hadn't worked as well is that you put people in that position to undertake that, to deliver the message or do the work, and you hadn't given them the capacity to do it. So even if it's that person's direct responsibility that there's been a mistake, you as a leader has to take the responsibility for that as well.
Yeah, no, I believe that also. Mate, so what's the most difficult part of being a leader?
So I don't like saying no to people. So that for me is one of the hardest things to do is that. So there's a couple of things. So one is around knowing when to say no, but just saying no is a pretty weak way of doing it. If you're saying no, you should try and give people an alternate, either through a different approach or through a different vector. That vector might be another person or another consultant or another group. So that's certainly something to consider. And then I put very high expectations on myself, Eric, to deliver. And sometimes dealing with the doubt, your internal doubt about your capacity to deliver above and beyond what you said you would do, that is a real challenge for many leaders. Certainly for me, I find that one of the biggest things to do.
Again, excuse me just for 1 sec, Chris. Gotta get rid of this flu.
That's not good.
Nah, it's this time of year, mate. The kids have had it. I've come off a highly tense time in this job, but we'll talk about that. Post podcast. Okay, so let's look at something more positive, Chris.
Yeah, all right.
How do you measure success as a leader?
So for me, my success is, I've actually, if you can go back, I try and think about what the end point, what the outcome should be. So what would I like to see happen at the end of an exercise, a leadership exercise? And if I've moved us along in that direction, for me, that's a success. So again, that's a leadership versus a management thing. Managers often they judge success by their outputs. Oh, we held a review, we developed a report, we did a workshop. That is a management function. The leadership role is to have taken that work that's been done and get a positive outcome for those involved. So for me, that is the number one thing you want to look at. The other thing around leadership is that for me, I always would hope to have left something behind that makes it better for the group or people that I've worked with, and or provides an opportunity for somebody to step into my place. So they're the key leadership things that I'd always like to see is I've built capacity and I've focused on outcomes, not on outputs.
Yeah, that's a very positive way to look at it, and it's not inconsistent with what other podcast guests have come up with in terms of what, how do you measure success, and that's always in the eye of the beholder. So I'm very much married to this thing about having successful outcomes where other people have been given permission to shine and to grow in particular roles. And so for the sake of the listeners, Chris's involvement in the National Seafood Industry Leadership Program, that was an example to me of someone who in that program, yes, okay, you're a facilitator, but you did give us some very good insights into what the leadership function was. And I think until you do the program, people don't realize the kinds of roles you're in, because when you're facilitating a course, people don't assign a level of seniority or experience to you. They think, well, here's another facilitator. They may or may not know what they're talking about. And until people do some digging as to who's talking to them and with them and trying to nurture this stuff, it can be quite trippy, because I only found out more about you after the program. And it made a few things stick in my mind why you did the things that you did in the program. So that's a function of experience too. So you know the industry and you know your audience, and that shows in that program. So for those listening, I can't recommend the program enough, and it's just unfortunate that Chris is moving on. And it would be good if you had said not being able to say no to that one and actually stayed on for longer, Chris. But I get.
Well, I did do an extra year or so, because we got a couple of we went from 1 year to 2 years. But again, it's about, like, I'm now 61 years old, Eric, which is not old. I get that.
It's not old. That's not old.
But in 5 years' time, if you don't start to make the move early enough, you don't give other people the opportunity to come in and take on that role. So now we've got fantastic person, Heidi Mummy's come into that, picked up that role, and that's going to give the people at Affectus some opportunity to move forward. And that's what I look to do. I try and that's how I see myself in my leadership role, is that I take on a servant leadership role rather than a command and control.
Yeah, and I've had the pleasure of interviewing on the podcast Heidi a little while back, and okay, so that's interesting to know. Look, mate, I've got some what would you call them, statements that I wanted to get your perspective on, and I'm sure these are going to be interesting. So take them at face value. There's no right or wrong here.
Okay.
On the job experience develops better leaders.
In some circumstances, I think that you need to have an understanding. So I think in the fishing industry particularly, we've tried to parachute in people with leadership skills from other sectors and other industries, and it's caused us some grief. So I think having some level of on-the-job experience helps leadership roles. Yep,
that's great. Okay, let's move on to the second one. Formal education helps to develop better leaders.
Not necessarily. Again, it's a bit the same like on-the-job experience. I think depending on the level of technical expertise you need, there is some benefits in having a formal education. So I've learned a lot of stuff for myself since I've been doing my postgrad study. So that's actually helped me understand my leadership role better. But I got to where I was without a formal education.
Yep.
So it's a bit horses for courses.
Yeah, sure, and that's understandable, and that can vary industry to industry and person to person, because I mentioned that you were the founder, owner, director of CA Consultants, and that suggests you've got that entrepreneurial bent, and that takes you to places you don't necessarily have to have formal quals to do stuff like that. And I've interviewed some in that space, and they basically say the same things that you're saying, is that you've got to take a chance, you've got to allow people to come in and influence what you're doing. So no, I get that. So
often you'll find too, Eric, that people who don't have who have on the job but not formal training, as they get further into their journey, will then take on some education, particularly around business management and understanding people in business, because you've got the drive, you've got the knowledge, but sometimes you need to understand what to do with that. And sometimes that formal education or a formal mentoring role can put you in the right spot there too.
Yeah, and that look, it's my podcast, it's our podcast, so I can talk on this if you're willing. That idea of mentoring, do you think it's done enough in our industry, let alone most industries that you've come across? Is it
no?
Is it valued?
I think if you're a mentor and you've been mentored, if you're a mentoree and have been mentored, you see the value in it. And good mentors. So I think one of the reasons it doesn't happen is because people are scared of their position.
Okay. Yep.
They think, if I spend my time upskilling Eric, he's going to come in and take my job. Whereas I reckon that's a good thing. So for me, I'd look at it and go, well, there's a chance for me to either lift my game so I can outcompete Eric in the spaces we're going, but also when I leave, I've left something behind. So that's critically disappointing. And why I say that, mate, is I'm up to almost 45 of these podcasts, and without exception, I think when mentoring has been mentioned, it's been quite a positive, life-changing, or at least career-directing process. And typically it's been informal, not so much a formal arrangement, but being able to draw, I think, on the skills of those that have been there and done it, and to learn from the best and the worst of those people. And look, just learning from the best and worst of leaders that you've dealt with, because I think in a career as illustrious as your own, so I think you've probably met some really good leaders and some really bad ones. And I reckon you learn more from the bad ones than you do the good ones. Yeah, and I've done some really poor leadership things in my own time too, Eric. So I've learned from those. If that reflective process is the key, and to take the time to do your reflections, think about what you've done, think about how it made you feel, think about what you might do next time, and then to do it next time and then reflect back on it, is an incredible learning tool to have. It's just so critical, and we don't do it because we're busy all the time. The other thing with the mentoring thing is that I think our structures don't allow it. And I'll use an example. Great organisation, FRDC, Fishery Research Development Corporation. They have a breadth and reach and depth that's unequalled in Australia. Yet we see so many of the same people churning up, run committees, be involved in a whole bunch of things, whereas we know there's hundreds of people out there that we could be upskilling by building their capacity and taking on the mentoring role with those people, by getting them to shadow people, by getting them coming to the meetings, getting them exposed, and then doing some formal feedback with them to identify where they see themselves going on the leadership journey. And that's just FRDC, that's one organisation, but we have the same. I mean, our fishing industry organisations run thin. The opportunity for you to have somebody shadowing you is almost negligible, but the benefit that the industry would get from it would be enormous.
Yeah, that's right.
You've got good skills, you've got great connections, you've got all those sorts of things that could help people from all those other industry groups that need help, and they have to call you up instead of being able to come in and shadow you and see what happens. So I think that mentoring is something that we should invest. And I'd probably that's one of the things I like to do as I sort of wind back, is look for opportunities to share learnings and knowledge with people. Like, I'm no champion in everything, but I reckon I've got a few things I could help people with.
Well, there's always an opportunity, mate, to keep talking around mentoring as part of the podcast process if you're up for the discussion.
always.
That'd be great. Look, so this is the part of the podcast where I indulge myself a little bit and ask some questions of the guests around some of the studies that I've been doing. And so I'm finishing my postgraduate studies like yourself. Have you finished your studies yet, Chris?
I've submitted my thesis. It went in
well done. Well done.
Thank you. Like there's a leadership learning. Don't ever do that again. Or make sure you've got the time and the resources to do it. But so that's been a 10-year challenge for me. And I finally got it in. So I've just got to hope that the assessors are generous and pass it without too much work, because I don't know if I've got the energy to do it.
Congratulations, mate. So I should be referring to you as Dr. Chris Calogeras.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
Not yet.
So as part of my studies, Chris, I'm looking at what are some of the core, critical, key leadership capabilities for what you might call fit for future leaders in the agricultural space. And the two that I landed on, because if I did all of the ones that I had an interest in, I think I'd ever get it finished. And you know what I'm talking about, is looking at strategic thinking and foresight as being the most critical. Now, what's your view on those two as leader capabilities, Chris?
Well, I think the strategic thinking is incredibly important to us. Those big questions, what if, what about, how does this look? And we struggle with that. We just did a session in Canberra last week on strategic thinking. Jill Briggs does one, and it's very challenging because we're asking people to think, not drop down into the operational side of stuff all the time. And it's really difficult, the industry that we work in, Eric, because we're surrounded by rules and regulations all the time. And so as soon as we ask a big question, we automatically think about why we can't do it. So strategic thinking is something that I think is so important, and we do not invest energy into it. Even our board meetings, like I'm sure your QSIA board would talk about strategic planning, but how much of strategic thinking do they do? How many big ideas are they prepared to explore? And my experience is it's a challenge, but it is the critical thing to get you. If you can't think strategically about where you're going to be over the horizon, you're going to get swamped, and that's what has happened to us as an industry.
Yeah, okay, that's quite an in-depth observation, and it's one that I think, if I can take some liberties here, I think affects agriculture more broadly.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't think it's unique to us, but I follow that. So, foresight.
Yeah, foresight. Hindsight is foresight. Is that what they're saying? Foresight is incredibly important too. I think that we're a very backward looking. Much of my agriculture experience is around looking backwards. We don't do the future studies. We don't think critically. We don't even teach ourselves to think critically and debate. And for me, those, like now our conversations are usually arguments versus a debate around different views and looking for some common ground. So I think that foresighting is something that we need to do. If you're looking around critical thinking and challenging ideas, is something we're poor at.
And you found that in your government time as well as industry, or just industry in particular?
Both. I think in most things, like in the olden days, because when I was first started in fisheries, Eric, we were about developing. We were about going forward. Our fisheries in Australia were underutilised, and we were looking for options to grow fisheries. And we opened up the genie, and we sent all the fishing people out to catch fish. And we gave them money to buy boats. We built ports. We built landings. We subsidised people. And then we had to try and plug this genie back in. And we're now seeing, so that was our development stuff. So we were looking for long-term development. We didn't do the critical thinking about it. So we opened it up, and now we're just trying to plug that up. We've done the same thing with the recreational industry now. And I call it an industry, the recreational industry, where we've opened up this Pandora's box of access. We've encouraged people to go fishing. We've encouraged investment, and we are going to struggle to be able to wind that back to sustainable levels as we move forward. So for me, that is that foresighting has not looked at the consequences of having these multiple competing, and this was a little bit different about agriculture versus fisheries, that common property aspect of it. We've opened up a Pandora's box where we're now fighting each other instead of having debates and conversations, thinking strategically and looking where we should all land in the future. So that's at a government level, a government policy level, and at a commercial fishing industry, at a recreational fishing industry sector, and also how do we bring our Indigenous brothers and sisters into this as well, to take them forward? Where's the foresight and future looking and strategic thinking around that sector as well?
Yeah, brilliant. That's quite excellent, Chris, and that is a good summary of the issues around commercial fisheries for those that have had some experience in them. And it's there is no easy answer to it, but I think this idea of being able to have difficult conversations is a way to get to resolutions. But unfortunately, sometimes those conversations either can't be had or are just politically too difficult. And that's I guess that's the nature of fisheries. Yep. I'm not telling you something you don't already know.
But I think that the thing about it too is that we've now gone to, instead of debating ideas, we're debating the person. So I don't like your views, so I challenge you as a person, and we all do it. We don't mean to, but we often label person as a commercial fisher. So we put a tag on that person as a commercial fisher or a rec fisher or an Indigenous fisher or a government person, and we attack the tag rather than the ideas that are being challenged. And that is where I feel I think we're struggling as a human race around that point at the moment, Eric, that we're not allowing ourselves to have disagreements and have civil debates. I don't have to agree with you. I shouldn't have to agree with you for me to still be able to have a conversation with you.
You're correct. Yeah. I'm very much back that. You should be able to defend each other, the right to have that view, irrespective of whether or not we agree with that view. Yeah, no,
and my job is to convince you in a either for you to convince me or for me to convince you, or us to come to common ground, or to agree to disagree, but still not hate you as a person. I don't have to agree with you. And I think that, man, if we could learn one thing, that would be the thing for us to do.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that thought, Chris. Final question, sir.
Okay.
What might you say to a younger version of yourself about being an effective leader?
Oh, gosh. So there's a whole lot of behaviours I probably wouldn't have done. So that has impacted on some of my opportunities. But I had good fun at the time, but they did impact a young, not so subtle guy. But the thing for me is that I reckon I would have be confident that I've got the ability and capacity to do just about anything I put my mind to.
Yep.
Within reason. Like, I'll never win an Olympic medal in the sprints or those sorts of things. But I think we often sell ourselves really short. And, I did my leadership program in the early 2000s, Eric. And as I walked out of it, I realised, well, actually, there's nothing I can't try and do in this area that I want to work in, because there's tools and there's networks and there's colleagues and there's experiences that are going to help me. So for me, that would be the number one thing, is don't be a bit more courageous in what you're trying to do. Have a go.
That's excellent, mate, and that's a fantastic way to end the podcast. So for those listening, I've been chatting with Chris Calogeras, who is rightly so a key figure in Australian commercial fishing circles. Chris is known pretty much everywhere I've travelled in this country around commercial fishing. So, mate, on behalf of those that do know you, I appreciate your counsel and your views on this industry and the help that you've given people without giving it a second thought. So really do appreciate that. And thank you for speaking with me tonight.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eric. It was actually good to have a bit of a reflect and a think too. So thank you.
No worries, mate. And for those listening, this has been Talking Leadership, and I will look forward to catching you all again on the next podcast. Thanks again, Chris.
Thanks, Eric.